The fourth consecutive day of Seattle's winter drizzle pressed itself against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the 42nd floor. Adrian Cole stood with his back to the window, a legal pad open in his left hand, a pen he hadn't used in 10 minutes in his right. The woman across the mahogany table had not looked at him directly once in the past hour. She looked at the floor plans. She looked at the sample menus. She looked at the single white orchid in the narrow vase on the credenza, a flower so still it seemed to be holding its breath. They were arguing about candles. Not in the way people argue about candles. Not wax versus soy, not pillar versus taper. They were arguing about what candles mean, whether 14 tapers arranged in a spiral communicated something about longing, or whether the whole idea was overwrought. Victoria Hale had said overwrought. Adrian had said that nothing in a wedding ceremony should be edited down to convenience. Victoria had gone very quiet after that. He didn't know he was planning his own wedding. He didn't know because she hadn't told him. She had hired him under the understanding that the groom was a private matter, a detail to be revealed at a later stage, she had said, in the tone that closes conversations. Adrian Cole was a professional. He had accepted that. What he could not have accepted, had he known, was the way she looked at him when he spoke about wedding vows. Not like a client evaluating a vendor, like someone deciding whether to trust a door that has been locked a long time. The contract had come through a referral. Adrian's company, Event Principals LLC, 7 employees including himself, did not usually receive calls from offices on floors this high. The call had come from a woman named Denise, who identified herself as executive assistant to Victoria Hale, founder and former CEO of Hale Systems, and who spoke with the particular precision of someone accustomed to being the last line of defense between her employer and the world. The budget was substantial. The timeline was compressed 12 weeks to a winter ceremony. The requirements were unusual. Full-service planning with complete discretion regarding the identity of the groom. The client would handle all communication with the groom's side directly. Adrian's team would interface only with the bride. Adrian had sat with the contract for 3 days. He had a rule about unusual conditions, not a hard rule, but a practiced one. He talked to his daughter about it, not about the specifics. Lily was 7. He didn't lay professional dilemmas at the feet of a 7-year-old, but he told her, over cereal on a Tuesday morning, that he had a job that felt a little strange, and he wasn't sure if strange was the same as wrong. Lily had considered this with the gravity she brought to all things. Then she said, "Sometimes things feel strange because they're new, Dad. New is okay." He had signed the contract that afternoon. The first meeting was on a Wednesday. The building lobby was marble and silence. The security desk, staffed by a man who had his name on a laminated badge, and his hands folded on the desk like a still life. Adrian checked in. He rode 42 floors in an elevator that played no music. He used the time to review his intake notes, the way he always did before a first client meeting, not to rehearse, but to clear his head of whatever had filled it on the drive over. Victoria Hale was shorter than he'd expected. He'd seen photographs, press junkets, conference panels, the Forbes profile from 3 years ago that had called her architecturally composed. In person, she was composed the way a drawn bow is composed. Energy held very carefully in a specific shape. Her office was spare in the way that expensive things are spare, not empty, but curated, every object earning its presence. She offered her hand. The handshake was brief and direct. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I'll need you to sign an additional NDA. My assistant will send it this evening." "Of course," Adrian said. They sat. The rain pressed at the glass. Somewhere below, the city moved in its gray way, indifferent to the conversation happening 42 stories above it. Victoria slid a folder across the table, preliminary aesthetic notes, color references, a timeline that had been annotated in red ink by a careful hand. Adrian opened the folder and began reading. He did not rush. He had learned that clients who required discretion above all else were paying, in part, for the experience of being taken seriously. A planner who skimmed was a planner who missed things. and missed things became the content of apology emails sent the day after an event. When he looked up, she was watching him read. "You have questions," she said. 1. He said. "The ceremony venue is listed as TBD. Do you have a preference, or is location also something you want me to source? I want you to source it. Then I'll need to know, indoor or outdoor." She looked at the rain for a moment, long enough that he didn't interrupt it. "Somewhere the weather can be felt," she said finally, "but can't come inside." He wrote that down. Verbatim. Because the answer was not logistical, it was the kind of answer that told him something true about what the client was actually asking for, underneath the question. She noticed that he wrote it down verbatim. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. They had met, though neither had named it a meeting, at the Cascadia Business Summit in late November. The Fairmont's Grand Ballroom had been converted for 300 guests. Tech founders, investors, policy consultants, the usual geometry of ambition arranged around past appetizers and carefully positioned name tags. Adrian was there in his professional capacity. His company had handled the logistics for 2 of the breakout sessions, audio-visual for the afternoon panels, dietary management for the catered dinner. He was the kind of person at these events who was everywhere and somehow invisible, checking earpiece cables, confirming seating charts, problem-solving in the margins of other people's important conversations. Victoria Hale had delivered the keynote. Adrian had not watched it from the audience. He had watched it from the side of the room, half his attention on the microphone levels, the other half against his own intention on the speaker. She spoke without slides. She stood at a plain lectern and said things that were true about failure in a way that did not sound like a conference talk. She had failed twice before Hale Systems. She had failed in ways that cost her money and people she trusted. She said the second kind of failure was worse, and then she described it plainly, without the softening language that public speakers usually reach for when the topic becomes too specific. Adrian had gone still during that part. He recognized something in it, the specific vocabulary of someone who has rebuilt rather than recovered. There is a difference. Recovery implies return. Rebuilding implies a different structure than the one that fell. After the keynote, during the standing cocktail hour, he had been redirecting a catering cart near the east hallway when she had turned a corner too quickly and nearly walked into him. They had both stopped. He had said, "Sorry, my fault. I should have," and she had said, "No, I wasn't watching." And for approximately 4 seconds, they had simply stood there, 2 people who had each narrowly avoided the other, in the particular suspended moment that follows a near collision. Then the moment had dissolved into the general noise of the event, and she had moved on. He had not thought about it again. Not consciously, not in a way he would have named. What he did not know, she had seen his name on the event credential hanging from his lanyard, Cole, Event Principals. What she did not know she was doing, filing it. The brain is not always honest about what it retains and why. Victoria had been engaged once. The man's name was Carter Westbrook, successful, charming, architecturally composed himself. The engagement had lasted 14 months. It had ended when she discovered he had been sharing photographs from her private phone, personal photographs, the kind that exist in every relationship as an act of trust with 2 friends, and eventually with a gossip site that had been pleased to receive them, and had published them with a headline that she did not read more than once. She had not filed a lawsuit. Her attorneys had recommended one. She had declined, on the grounds that a lawsuit would extend the period during which she was required to be publicly defined by the event. She had spent 3 months alone in a house she owned on the coast reading, running on the beach road in the early mornings, cooking things that took a long time, and then she had come back to work and not spoken about it again. The damage it had done was not visible from the outside. It was the kind of damage that changes the operating temperature of a person, the baseline level of warmth they allow toward any new presence in their life. What had once been openness became a gatekeeping process so finely tuned that most people didn't realize it was happening. They simply experienced Victoria Hale as someone difficult to know. They weren't wrong, they just didn't have the context. Adrienne Cole, event coordinator, had cleared some preliminary threshold she couldn't name. She wasn't sure why. It may have been the way he had apologized for something that wasn't his fault, and then immediately corrected himself when she told him it wasn't. No doubling down, no explanation. Just correction accepted, moving on. Small things. She was aware they were small things. She filed them anyway. He had been married once. Her name was Rachel Pemberton, which she had kept after the divorce, because she said it was as much hers as his at that point, and the paperwork to change it back wasn't worth the administrative cost. He had found this reasonable. He found a lot of things about Rachel reasonable. In retrospect, which was one of the qualities that made the divorce grieve him in a particular quiet way. They had been 26 when they married and 31 when the marriage ended, and the 5 years between those 2 points had been, in aggregate, more good than bad, which made the ending harder, not easier, because there was nothing clean to hate. No betrayal. No dramatic failure. Just 2 people who had grown in directions that did not converge, and who had been honest enough with themselves and each other to name it. Rachel had moved to Portland with a woman named Diane who taught ceramics at a community college, and who, by all available evidence, was exactly right for her. She was remarried now, though in Washington state the terminology had been updated. She sent birthday cards for Lily that arrived early and were always the right kind, the kind with space to write in them, not the kind that says everything for you. Adrienne thought that said something true about who she was. She always left room for the other person to contribute. He had lost most of what they had accumulated together, because that's what division means. He had kept the apartment her choice. She had wanted a fresh start geographically as well as personally. He had kept Lily in the shared custody arrangement that had become, over time, closer to full custody, as Rachel's new life required more of her attention, and Lily had, with characteristic directness, told her mother that she preferred Seattle anyway because of the library. He had rebuilt the business from a one-man operation in a co-working space near Pioneer Square to a 7-person company with an office in Capitol Hill and a client list that, if not glamorous, was dependable. Corporate events, nonprofit fundraisers, the occasional private celebration with a budget that reminded him not all of Seattle's money was in technology. What he had developed, through all of it, was a philosophy about marriage that was not romantic in the conventional sense. He believed that the ceremony mattered not as performance, but as declaration. He believed that vows should be written by hand, in private, and that they should cost the writer something in the writing, that the difficulty of finding the right words was part of the point, because the difficulty was evidence of care. He believed that the decision to marry was not made on the wedding day but on some quieter day before it, when no one was watching and the weather was ordinary, and the person chose yes anyway. The ceremony was the public acknowledgement of a private choice that had already been made. That was what gave it weight. 2 people choosing each other when no one is looking, was how he put it. He had said it once at a client consultation, offhandedly, and the client had started crying. He had filed it as a thing he should say more carefully, in more deliberate contexts. On their 3rd planning session, he said it to Victoria Hale. She had asked him what he thought made a marriage last. It was an unusual question from a client. Most clients wanted to know about linens, or whether the DJ could learn a specific song, or how far in advance to order the flowers. He answered honestly because her tone had made it clear she wanted an honest answer and not a professional one. He said, he thought the ceremony mattered, but not in the way people thought it mattered. He thought what sustained a marriage was the private act of choosing that happened long after the ceremony on an ordinary Tuesday, in the middle of a disagreement, in the gap between what you need and what is available, and deciding yes, still. She wrote nothing down. She was very still for a moment. Then she said, "That's a good answer," and moved on to the next agenda item, with the efficiency of someone filing something away rather than dismissing it. He noted that she had not asked who had taught him that. Most people asked. The question usually opened into the story of the divorce and the rebuilding, which he could tell in several registers, depending on the context. She had not opened the door. He had not offered to walk through it. Their sessions ran late because Victoria's days were long, and her evenings were the only time the calendar had any give to it. By the time her afternoon calls and board obligations and the constant low-grade management of her transition out of day-to-day operations at Hale Systems had cleared enough room for extended planning conversations, it was usually after 7. The building's upper floors thinned out. The cleaning crew moved through with quiet efficiency, nodding at Adrian when they passed the conference room, not asking why he was still there. He noticed that Victoria became marginally different in the later hours. Not warmer, exactly. More settled. The particular vigilance she carried into the early part of the day, the brisk efficiency, the checked watch, the one hand on the phone readiness relaxed slightly by 8 o'clock, as if the day's demands had been satisfied and she could now attend to something else. He liked that. He didn't examine why he liked it, because examining it would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have made him a person who had feelings about his client, and that was a category he preferred not to inhabit while the contract was active. They argued in the particular way that respectful people with different opinions argue without elevation, with precision. She wanted the ceremony spare. He pushed for elements he believed earned their presence. She said the program didn't need a quote on the cover. He suggested they find a quote that justified its existence and see if she still felt that way. She considered this for approximately 1 beat, the pause of someone genuinely processing rather than reflexively agreeing, and then said, "Fine." 3 days later, she emailed him a passage from an old letter. No attribution. It was 12 words. It was exactly right. He wrote back, "This works." She replied, "I know." He noticed that she did not explain where she had found it, or why she had taken 3 days. He did not ask. Their communication had developed a particular economy. They said what needed to be said and then stopped, which he found restful in a way he hadn't known he needed. On a Thursday in late January, they were going over the draft script for the ceremony itself. The officiant was confirmed a retired judge named Bernard Hollis, who Victoria had described as someone who speaks like he means it, which Adrian had interpreted correctly as no filler language, no borrowed sentiment, no pauses inserted for emotional effect that the audience was expected to fill. They reached the section for personal vows. "How long?" she asked. "Typically 2 to 4 minutes each," Adrian said. "Long enough to say something real, short enough that the guests are still present for it." What's the difference between 2 minutes and 4 minutes? The difference between saying one true thing well and saying 3 true things adequately. She looked at him across the table. The rain on the 42nd floor glass had become so constant it no longer registered as sound, only as texture. "I haven't written mine yet," she said. "You have 6 weeks." "I know." A pause that had some thought in it. "What do you think a vow should do?" He set his pen down on the legal pad. "It should close a distance," he said. "Not the distance between 2 people, that's what the ceremony is for. The distance between the person who is speaking and the truth they've been carrying. The hum of the building's climate system. The rain. The distant sound of the cleaning cart in the hallway, growing fainter." She looked at him for a moment that lasted longer than the question required. He held the look because looking away would have been its own statement. Then she looked back at the document. "Good," she said. "I'll use that." Adrian drove home through wet streets and did not think about the way she had looked at him when he answered. He thought about the venue, a barn property east of the mountains that had sent updated photographs that afternoon, and which looked, in the dusk lighting of the shots, genuinely beautiful. He thought about catering timelines. He thought about whether to order Thai or cook. He cooked. He sat in the kitchen for longer than he needed to sit in the kitchen, with a cup of tea he'd made and then forgotten, cold now, in front of him. In the 5th week of planning, Victoria's assistant Denise forwarded a document titled Ceremony Narrative Couples Story. This was standard. Many ceremonies included a brief recounting of how the couple had met, delivered by the officiant or a designated reader at the beginning of the ceremony, before the processional, as a way of giving guests who didn't know both parties a sense of the ground they were standing on. Adrian needed the story to prepare the program and to brief Judge Hollis on tone and length. He opened the document at his apartment on a Sunday afternoon. Lily, at the kitchen table behind him, doing a jigsaw puzzle she had declared would take all day and was clearly going to take all weekend. He read the document. Then he read it again. The story described a man who had been through a difficult divorce, who ran a small company with a small team, who had built it from very little and who considered the rebuilding to be the most honest period of his professional life because it had required him to be exactly as capable as he was and not more. Who believed, the document said, in choosing people rather than being chosen in the active rather than the passive, the deliberate rather than the accidental. Adrian set his coffee down carefully. He read the paragraph a third time. The language was careful, no name, no specific industry, no identifying detail that would survive a fact check. But the architecture of the person described was familiar in a way that made the back of his neck feel warm, and not in a comfortable way. He told himself, "This is a coincidence." Divorced men who have rebuilt their lives from modest circumstances and arrived at a philosophy of intentional choosing are not rare. The description fit a category of person, not a specific individual. He was not the only person who had arrived at that particular set of beliefs. The combination was not so unusual. He told himself this convincingly enough to close the document. He helped Lily with the jigsaw puzzle, specifically with the sky portion, which she had determined was impossible on the grounds that all the pieces looked the same, a complaint he found difficult to argue with. He made dinner. He watched most of a football game in which he had no investment in the outcome and went to bed at a reasonable hour. He did not sleep for some time. He lay in the dark of the apartment, listening to the rain on the window, and thought about the thing he had told himself was a coincidence. In the morning, it still looked like a coincidence. He decided to let it stay that. At the 7th planning session, a Thursday in early February, Victoria placed an envelope on the table beside the usual portfolio of materials. "The vows," she said, without preamble. "For the program notes, you'll need to know the approximate word count for the ceremony timing. You can open it if you need to." The envelope was sealed with a strip of cream-colored wax. Adrian looked at it without touching it for a moment. "You sealed it," he said. "Yes. A sealed envelope is a sealed envelope. I said you can open it." "I know." He picked it up. Something about the wax made him feel the object deserved careful handling, which he recognized as an irrational feeling, and had it anyway. "I'll handle it at home, when I can give it proper attention." She nodded once, and they moved on to the florist's revised estimate. He opened it that evening, at his desk, after Lily was in bed and the apartment had settled into its nighttime sounds. He used a letter opener, going slowly along the edge. The wax held and then released cleanly. The vows were handwritten on 2 sheets of heavy cream paper. Her handwriting was what he would have predicted, precise, slightly compressed. Every letter formed with the clarity of someone who has decided that legibility is a courtesy. He began reading for length, and then he stopped reading for length and read for content. The vows were addressed to a you that had no name. They spoke about watching someone who did not know they were being watched, the specific quality of a person's attention when no audience is present, when they are simply themselves, in the unperformed version. They spoke about what it meant to discover that someone's private self was better than their public self, and the strange relief of that. They spoke about choosing not because certainty had arrived, but because the alternative to choosing was a smallness she had been practicing for too long and had decided to stop. The last line of the vows read, "I choose you, even when no one is watching." Adrian put the paper down on his desk. He sat in the silence of his apartment and let the silence be what it was. The refrigerator cycled on. A car moved through the wet street below, its tires making the sound that wet streets make. Lily's nightlight cast its stripe of amber light under her door. He picked the paper up again. Read the last line again. Read it a third time, not because he didn't understand it, but because some things require more than one reading to become real. Those were his words. Not inspired by him, his exact meaning, in his exact shape, assembled from the same material. The phrase about choosing when no one is watching. He had said those words in this woman's presence, and those words were now the conclusion of her wedding vows. And there was no other groom named in any of the materials he had been given, and the love story document described a man who matched him in every way that mattered. And the ring he did not yet know about the ring was still 2 weeks away. He put the paper down a second time. He placed both hands flat on the desk and breathed carefully, the way he breathed when he needed to think clearly, and the available thoughts were arriving too fast. He did not yet allow himself to arrive at the conclusion. The conclusion, if true, rearranged everything. He needed more information before he rearranged everything. This was his professional habit, and it served him now. The 4th week of February. The rain had become so consistent that it no longer registered as weather, it was a condition, like the altitude or the sea level, a permanent quality of the environment that one adapted to rather than commented on. Adrian arrived for the session carrying a portfolio and a thermos of coffee, which he had stopped pretending was for professional reasons 3 weeks ago. Victoria was already at the table. She was almost always already at the table when he arrived, another thing he had noted without examining. In front of her was a small wooden box, the kind used by jewelers for presentation. Square, hinged, dark wood with a small brass clasp. "I need your opinion," she said, before he had fully settled into his chair. "On the ring. On the band. I had 2 options and made a decision. But I want another set of eyes before I confirm with the jeweler." He set down his portfolio and thermos. She pushed the box across the table without opening it. He opened it himself. The ring inside was simple, brushed platinum, no stone. The kind of ring that makes no argument for itself beyond the material and the craft, that says, "The statement is in the choice of restraint." It was beautiful in the way that restrained things are beautiful, which is quietly and without announcement. He was about to say something about the finish, about how the brushed surface would hold up over time, when he noticed the inside of the band. He tilted the ring toward the window. The gray February light came through the glass, and he angled the band until the engraving inside caught it. "To Adrian, the only man I ever chose." He did not move. The rain pressed at the glass. The climate system made its low sound. Victoria's hands were folded on the table in front of her. Very still. The way hands are still when the person they belong to is making a deliberate choice not to move them. Adrian set the ring back in the box, very carefully, lowered it straight down into the velvet. The soft click of the clasp settling was the only sound in the room for what felt like a measurable length of time. He looked at her. "There is no other groom," he said. It was not a question. He had been a professional long enough to know the difference between a thing he didn't know and a thing he was now certain of. "No," she said. Her voice was steady, a long silence. The city, 42 floors below, continued its indifferent operations. "How long?" he asked. "Since November." "Since the conference at the Fairmont." He looked at the box. He looked at his hands on the table, which were not quite as still as hers. He looked at the rain. When he looked at her again, the look was specific. Not the anger that would have been simpler, not the confusion that would have been more flattering to her. Something quieter and more complicated than either the expression of a person trying to understand something that has more layers than they had assigned to it. He stood up, not quickly and not dramatically. He moved the way he moved when he needed to keep his hands occupied in order to keep his thoughts organized. He capped his pen. He gathered the edges of his portfolio. He moved his thermos from the center of the table to the edge near his chair. "I need to say something," he said. Still standing. "Say it. You are a person who has been genuinely hurt by someone who converted your trust into something he could use." He kept his voice level. Not cold level, the way you keep a surface level when you're carrying something that could spill. "I understand that. I understand what that kind of betrayal does to the architecture of trust in a person. I'm not saying it didn't happen, or that the damage isn't real." She said nothing. Her hands remained still on the table. "But what you did," he paused. He chose the next words with the care he would give to anything that mattered. "You made me a participant in a decision without my knowledge or consent. You hired me. You interviewed me, that's what this was. 12 weeks of interviewing me under the cover of a professional engagement. You watched me talk about honesty and integrity and the importance of genuine choice. And the entire time, I wasn't making a choice. I was being assessed. You had the information, I didn't. I know that," she said. Her voice was steady in the particular way of someone who is not surprised by what they're hearing, because they've already said it to themselves. "That's not love," he said. "That's not even a test. A test implies both parties know they're being tested. What you built was an experiment with one blinded subject, and I don't consent to being the experiment." He picked up his thermos. He picked up his portfolio. He stood for a moment at the edge of the table, not because he was uncertain, but because he was the kind of person who completed his thoughts before leaving rooms. "I'm withdrawing from the project. I'll send formal notice tomorrow morning. My team will receive their contracted fees in full. They did the work. They'll be paid for it. That's not negotiable." "Adrian, I know what you wanted to find out," he said. "I understand it. You wanted to see if I was the kind of person who maintains his integrity when he thinks nobody is evaluating it. You wanted proof that was gathered without the contamination of mutual knowledge." He was at the door now. He stopped, not with hesitation, with intention. "I think you are a remarkable person," he said. "I have thought that for several weeks, and I didn't let myself look at it directly, because looking at it would have been inappropriate while I was under contract. But I'm not willing to walk into a future that was designed without me present for the designing. Whatever I might have chosen, if you had given me the information and asked, that's the choice that would have meant something. Not this." He left. The elevator was empty. He pressed the lobby button and stood watching the floor numbers descend. In the marble lobby, the man at the security desk nodded. Adrian nodded back. Outside, the rain was the same rain it had been for days, indifferent, persistent, entirely uninterested in the state of things on the 42nd floor. He drove home through it. He did not turn on the radio. She did not call. This was intentional. She sat with the choice not to call the way she sat, with hard financial decisions not pleasantly, not with equanimity, but with the clear-eyed recognition that discomfort was not the same as error. She had made the error. The discomfort was the correct response to the error. Working to minimize the discomfort by calling him would be a continuation of the impulse that had created the problem, managing conditions in order to avoid exposure. Her office felt different. This was not something she examined too closely, because she knew exactly where that examination led. On the third day, Denise stood in the doorway and asked whether she should begin reaching out to alternate event planning vendors to assess their availability for the remaining timeline. Victoria said, "Not yet." Denise said, "The ceremony is in 6 weeks." Victoria said, "I know." "Not yet." Denise nodded and left and did not ask again, because she had been Victoria's assistant for 4 years and had learned which silences were temporary and which ones needed to work themselves out. On the 6th day, Victoria sat in her apartment, the 12th floor, the view that was functional rather than spectacular, which she had chosen specifically because spectacular views require upkeep of a certain orientation she didn't always have. And she did the thing she had been approaching and retreating from for 6 days. She thought honestly about what she had done and why. The surface answer was the one she had already named to herself. She had wanted to see him in conditions where he didn't know he was being observed, because the performance that people put on for potential partners is not the person. She had wanted the unperformed version. She had wanted data that hadn't been staged for her benefit. The deeper answer, the one that required more honesty. She was not primarily afraid of being used again. She had built systems against being used. The security procedures were thorough and tested. What she was afraid of was something that no system addressed. The possibility that her own judgment was unreliable, that she had been shaped by what Carter Westbrook had done into a person whose instincts could no longer be trusted, that the warm feeling she had about someone might mean the same thing it had meant before, which was mistake incoming. She had not been testing Adrian. She had been testing herself. She had been asking, if I am simply present with someone, without the pressure of courtship on either side, without the performance that mutual knowledge requires, will I still arrive at a good person, or will I arrive at another version of the same mistake? She had arrived at a good person. And then she had not told him, because telling him would have required trusting the conclusion, and trusting her own conclusions was precisely what she was no longer sure she could do. She sat with this in the quiet of the 12th floor for a long time. Outside, the rain had not stopped. On the 11th day, she put on a coat. She had the address from the contract file, which she had not accessed in the 11 days since he had left the 42nd floor, and which she accessed now without telling herself she was accessing it, because she was done with the kind of dishonesty that hid inside her own reasoning. She drove to Capitol Hill. She found the building a converted warehouse, 6 stories, the kind of place that had been made livable without being made fashionable, which told her something she stored without naming. The hallway outside apartment 3C smelled faintly of something baked, and of the particular quality of air inside buildings where people live ordinary lives that are full rather than curated. She knocked. He opened the door in a flannel shirt and an expression she recognized as the expression of someone who has been interrupted in a task they were using as a proxy for not thinking. From somewhere inside the apartment, she could hear a child's voice, not words, just melody, the kind of shapeless humming that children produce when they are absorbed in something and don't need an audience for it. Victoria had prepared several things to say. She had composed them with care over the previous 2 days, which was how she managed most important communications, by preparing, then delivering, then assessing. The preparation was done. She said none of what she'd prepared. I owe you a real conversation, she said. Not a managed one. I'd like to have it, if you're willing to hear me. He studied her face for a moment. She let him. She did not fill the moment, or adjust her expression, or give him anything to work with beyond the fact of her presence at his door. Without an appointment, in a coat that was wet at the shoulders from the walk between her car and his building. Lily's here, he said. I know. I can come back at a different time. No. He stepped back from the door. The apartment was lived in the way that places are lived in by people who are busy with real things. Books stacked rather than arranged. A jigsaw puzzle on the kitchen table in the early stages of completion, a child's rain boots by the door in yellow rubber and lightly muddy, a smell of coffee and something sweet from earlier in the day. The kind of home that had not been prepared for visitors, which meant it was telling the truth about itself. Lily appeared from a hallway with the directness of a child who has heard something interesting and decided to investigate. She was small and dark-haired like her father, and she assessed the visitor with the frank, uncomplicated curiosity of someone who has not yet learned that staring at people requires justification. Are you the lady from Dad's work? She asked. One of them, Victoria said. Lily considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. He talks about work a lot, she said, but not about specific people. You must be one of the interesting ones. Something in Victoria's chest did something she did not have a clinical name for. Adrian made a sound that was almost a laugh. Lil, can you go finish your puzzle? I need more pieces to finish my puzzle. The pieces are all there, not the ones I need." She disappeared back down the hallway with the unhurried certainty of someone who knows they have made their point and doesn't need to wait for acknowledgement. Adrian and Victoria stood in the kitchen. He poured coffee without asking whether she wanted any, which was either presumption or familiarity, and she accepted it without deciding which it was. She sat at the table, across from the jigsaw puzzle. He sat across from her. She told him the truth. All of it, not the version that edited herself more favorably, but the full version, including the parts that did not reflect well on her logic or her courage. She told him about Carter Westbrook, not the public-facing summary she had given at the coastal house and then never repeated, but the actual experience. The morning she had found out, the specific quality of the hour that followed, what it had done to the internal system she used to evaluate people and situations. She told him about the decision to hire him, how it had begun, what it had been when it began, and what it had become by the third week, which was no longer a controlled observation but a genuine looking forward to, a thing she had not chosen and had not known how to dismantle without dismantling the entire structure. "By the time I understood what was happening," she said, "I had built something that I couldn't deconstruct without losing both of us." Or I told myself that. It was probably not true. It was probably fear wearing the costume of practical concern. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Not an evaluating quiet, a processing one. She had learned to tell the difference. "Over 12 weeks of watching him work, what you're describing," he said finally, "is a person who didn't trust herself to choose right, and who built a system to choose for her, without telling the subject. Yes, I'm the subject. Yes, and the system worked." She looked at him. "In the sense that I arrived at a conclusion I believe is accurate, yes. In the sense that the method was acceptable, no." He was quiet again. Outside the window, the rain continued, indifferent to the kitchen. "What do you want now?" he asked. "Not from the situation, from me." She set her coffee down. It was a careful gesture, the kind that happens when a person is using an action to buy themselves the half-second required to say something they have decided to stop managing. "I want to start from the actual beginning," she said. "Not from the contract, not from November. From right now, with both of us present and both of us informed. I don't know what that looks like. I don't have a plan for it. I'm here without a plan, which is not a state I usually allow myself, because states without plans tend to produce outcomes I didn't design. And I'm here anyway. Because the alternative to being here is a kind of smallness I've decided I'm no longer willing to practice." He recognized his own words, the language from the vows she had written. He recognized that she was using them deliberately, not as a trick, but as the most precise available expression of what she meant, which was also what he had meant when he first said them. He looked at her for a long time. "Lily has soccer on Saturdays," he said. "She's 7. The skill level is not what you'd call refined, but she loves it, and I'm usually there on the sideline at 9 in the morning with terrible coffee and nowhere else to be. If you want to start somewhere, that's somewhere I know how to be." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like a real place," she said, from down the hallway. "Dad, I found the pieces I needed." "Good, Lil, but now there are different pieces that I don't have." Adrian looked at Victoria with the expression of someone who has made a certain peace with the beautiful, unresolvable nature of jigsaw puzzles and children, and perhaps most things worth attending to. "That's usually how it goes," he said. Victoria said, "I'm starting to understand that." The ceremony was small by any standard that the guests had individually experienced. 40 people. A converted barn 40 miles east of Seattle. In a valley where the winter light came in, low and gold, through the western windows in the late afternoon, as it did at that latitude in February, when you positioned yourself correctly relative to the hills. They had planned it together. Actually together, sitting at his kitchen table after Lily was in bed, or at her conference table in the early mornings before her day demanded her, with the distinction between the person with the clipboard and the person being planned for dissolved, replaced by something that had no professional category and didn't need one. He had insisted on the candles. The spiral of 14 tapers along the aisle, which he had originally called overwrought and which, in the actual room, in the actual low winter light, were not overwrought at all. She had not said he was right. She had looked at them before the guests arrived and said, "This is what I meant when I said somewhere the weather can be felt but can't come inside." He had understood. Judge Bernard Hollis stood at the front of the room and spoke like he meant it. There was no filler. There were no borrowed sentiments. He said specific, true things about the specific people in front of him because Victoria had spent an hour on the phone with him the week before, and he had listened with the attention of someone who understood that the ceremony was only as real as the preparation behind it. The guests, people from the separate worlds of two lives that were only now beginning to exist in the same geography, sat in the barn chairs with the particular stillness that settles over a room when something real is happening. Victoria spoke first. She had rewritten the vows from the sealed envelope, not entirely, but substantially. In the places where the first draft had been written by someone who was still half hiding, and the second draft was written by someone who had decided to stop. The last line remained. She had told Adrian about the last line, where it came from, that she had taken his words because they were the truest ones available. He had said, "They were always yours to take." When it was his turn, he spoke without notes. He spoke about choosing not the romantic version of choosing, which is often a story about certainty arriving like weather. He spoke about choosing in the absence of certainty, in the presence of information that is incomplete and will always be incomplete, because the future withholds its content by design. He spoke about someone arriving at his door in a wet coat, without a plan, in the rain. Because she had decided that the thing she was afraid of was less important than the thing she wanted. He said it without looking at anything but her. Lily, in the front row, wearing a dress she had selected on the grounds that it was the precise color of a particularly good sunset she had once seen from the car window on the drive to her grandmother's, reached over at some point during the vows and took her grandmother's hand. She had not been asked to. She did it because it felt right, which is the best reason for most actions that matter. After the ceremony, after the dinner that ran longer than planned in the good way that dinners run longer than planned, after the guests had drifted out into the clear cold of the valley, night with their coats and their conversations and the lingering warmth of the room behind them, Adrian stood outside the barn door. The night was clear. The valley held the dark the way valleys do fully, without apology. The rain, which had been continuous for most of the month, had stopped sometime in the early afternoon and had not returned. Stars, which are usually hidden over Seattle behind the particular quality of cloud that city produces, were visible here in numbers that required a moment of adjustment. Victoria came and stood next to him. She did not take his hand immediately. She stood beside him and looked at the same sky he was looking at, and the moment was its own thing before it was anything else. "Still no plan?" he said. "Completely without one," she said. He said, very quietly, so that it was only the valley and the stars and the two of them. "This time, I know I'm being chosen." She did not say anything. She didn't need to. She took his hand, and the stars did what stars do when no one is managing them, which is simply to be present, in their enormous and undesigned way, for whatever is happening below.